So yeah, I'll straight go into the demo. Actually, the thing that makes me nervous most is that we've never so far in the history of RapidMiner scheduled a release to go out the door during a talk. So don't press F5 too frequently. That will make Marco nervous in Dortmund. So what I show you now, you can actually download ideally shortly after the presentation. So let me jump right into RapidMiner. This is what you know. And I'll show you a couple of things that are new from 6.5 that you haven't seen before, but I'll also say a few words about things that we've added in 6.4 and 6.3 already. I know we still know, Ingo has said that we still have a couple of open source users that still use the version 5.3, which may not even have kept up with 6. So you may even missed a few things that you may not even have seen in 6.4 or 6.3. One of them is this one here. That is actually pretty basically a simple thing, but which helps this whole idea of collaboration a lot. What this does is it just adds a post-it to your process, right? So, so I don't know who of you have found this button. Actually, I don't know if you're following all our newsletters and blog posts where we pointed you to it. Maybe you missed this button. So this is actually very useful. So you can comment your workflows here and your individual operators. That's particularly useful if you really work in a team, because even if you don't work in a team, if you go back to a process half a year later, most of the time you don't know what it does anymore. So say, I don't know, you load your data sets, then you can attach your your comment to that operator. I don't know, say load from data warehouse or so, update every hour or so, whatever. You can comment your individual operators, and you can also comment the entire process. So you can detach these little post-its here. Load data, score it, build model, evaluate, etc. So you can move that around. You can even, if you want to, you can even do fancy things like wrap it around multiple operators. Ingo Mirswa is tweeting about this apparently. So you can group multiple operators into this comment. Like so, for instance. That actually makes your process a bit more beautiful, but for sure it makes it more useful, right? So this will help teams, but also individuals significantly when they build process and collaborate. So let me continue a bit with this process. Say we are building a cross-validation here. So we do some standard stuff. Build a decision tree and apply our model. Do some performance evaluation. So I'm doing this manually right now just for the sake of doing it. Connect the stuff. So who of you knows, I'm loading a data set now. I'm doing a standard cross-validation with a decision tree and applying a model here. So if I run this process now, what happens? Oh, I didn't remember that. So most people now will press this button and nothing will happen because, as you just said, I have not connected this, right? So many people actually forget this connection, in particular when they use it for the first time. Also experienced people do that sometimes, as I just did. So if you're an experienced RapidMiner user, you would expect that nothing happens because only side effects happen. This process is being executed, but there's no result, so you wouldn't see anything. Now, RapidMiner is actually warning you before you do these kinds of mistakes, right? This is not an error message in the classical sense that it tells you your process failed. It just tells you the setup of your process is wrong. You haven't anything connected here. So this is something that you can ignore, so you can just run it anyway, just as you would have before. Then your process is being executed, but well, that's it. So you may have seen, if you look into the icon here at the bottom left-hand side of the operator, which is currently covered. It's briefly executed, you see that? So the process is running, but it doesn't produce any result. So what you actually want to do is you want to connect this and follow this hint, and then you get the usual results that you all know. So these kinds of checks are done for a couple of things. To show you the difference again, I could, for instance, just use an operator to retrieve data from the repository. If I do that and run this process now, this is red already, which indicates there's something wrong. This is red here, but many people don't see that. But now you really see it. So you get the hint before you run the process, actually, there's a parameter missing. It's even highlighted here. This is the parameter that you have to fill. And the nice thing is, if that would be a long-running process and this operator would be executed only after an hour or something, you would get this warning as a pre-flight check. You can still run it, but then, in fact, in this case, as opposed to that type of error before, this turns into a real red error message, the beauty of which depends on the projector you're using. Looks kind of different here. So this now is a real error, because, in fact, I mean, this warning was something that you can't ignore, so if you fix that now, of course, everything works again. So, yeah, this is the one thing that is new in RapidMiner. So really, this will make things a lot easier, I guess, for new users, but also for experienced people, because these are things that you forget every now and then it's in particular very annoying if that happens throughout your process, and we will warn you more early and make you more productive this way. So there's one more change to the user interface, to the user experience of RapidMiner that I'm going to present to you. Those of you who have attended last year's meeting, there was the filter examples user interface that we have significantly changed and made easier with this UI here. That's one of the most frequently used operators. In fact, there's one operator which is as frequently used as this one, which was really not so easy to use. Right, that's the generate attributes operator. So as you know, oh, that's the wrong data set. Let's just use the infamous Iris data set once again. As you know, with the generate attributes operator, you can, in fact, compute things. Basically, you can just write down expressions and they are being evaluated. So you can just give it any name. And then you can do things like add attributes, for instance, extract values from strings, do date operations and stuff like that. So that looks completely different now, because you know there's a lot of functions in RapidMiner that are available. And if you know everything by heart, for instance, if you know that it's square root or something, then you can type it, or now even if you type it correctly at least, then you can type this. So that's easy. But in fact, most of the time you don't know the functions that you're looking for. Yesterday, during the game, actually, we learned that there's an XOR function. I didn't even know that by myself, actually, to be very honest. We just used unequals. Now we have a search function here, and this way you will find everything much more easily, even if you don't know in which group it is. So we have grouped those things into, well, logical groups, like doing things with texts, or transforming texts, cutting pieces out, concatenating strings and stuff like that. Date functions. But if you don't know what category to look in, you can also search. So date, there are conversion functions that convert dates into strings or numbers, and date manipulation functions that you will find across multiple groups. So that makes it a lot easier. And in particular, those which require constants, like you want the full date or only date and time and stuff like that. These constants may not always be it may not always be immediately clear how they are, how these functions are used. We have some built-in documentation here that should help you to use it. If you use the parsing function here for strings, you will also find the respective constants here in a list. So you want a short date or a long version with seconds and so on and so forth, or the full date. So these constants are all here. That will make using this a lot easier. And in fact, I have to admit that I had problems memorizing all these constants earlier before and looking them up in the documentation. It was a kind of lengthy process. So that's a lot easier here. You have all the attributes in place to select from. You have A3 times A4 in case you want to compute that from the iris data set. You have the special attributes nicely grouped here. You can use your expressions here if label equals, I don't know, iris setosa or whatever. You can do fancy stuff here. You have syntax highlighting, as you see, so you can pair the groups. And really, this is very helpful. So this tells you right now it's correct. And in case you ever forget a parenthesis or have too many of them, you immediately see what's wrong with it, and you will get your error messages there and clearly highlighted what the problem is. So that's much easier. Also, the use of macros is much easier. I don't know how many of you know macros. Let me, before I show you this, actually define a macro. So macros are something that you can replace where things, parameters, so to say, variables are replaced by values, right? So I can define that with a set macro operator. We have loop operators where macros take on different values one after another. And when you use these, when you use these inside the expression editor, actually, what did I do? Sorry, I didn't run this. You have to. So, if you use these inside the expression editor, I mean, there's a cryptic thing like this is the way percentage, curly braces. So in case you didn't know that, you don't have to memorize that anymore. You can click on this now. Oops, you can, on the wrong one, on the right one. And then you can insert it as text, for instance. Right? And those of you who are experts will recognize the difference. So if you wanted to get a string earlier, you had to put this into quotes, right? Now this string will just evaluate to percentage, curly brace, open macro, closing curly braces. So this you don't need to do that anymore. And the good thing is you don't have to worry anymore about quoting, right? Because if this used to have a blank in it or a quote in it, this could have easily gone wrong earlier, and you would have to do all kinds of magic. This is a normal function like every other function in the expression now, so no more escaping quoting problems and so on and so forth. And if this macro actually refers to an attribute name, even if it has a blank in it or something, or a parenthesis in it, which was kind of tricky earlier, you can just say insert and evaluate, and it will look like this, right? That will flawlessly work then, even with the funny macro and attribute names. Even if you have blanks now, you can, if you have an attribute with a blank, you can put that in brackets now. So these problems are also all resolved. Much easier to use, and it's 2.5 times faster because it's now our own implementation rather than the library. So final thing I'm going to show, the wisdom of the crowds has been in the tool since quite some time, so there's recommendations of operators that you probably know. But that has, in fact, been improved quite significantly. So imagine a situation where you start by loading some data sets, and then you do a cross-validation. You're being recommended certain operators that make sense, like inside the cross-validation, most of the time you want to apply a model, you want to evaluate the performance, right? And then you may want to do other things like looping over attributes, for instance. And when you loop over attributes, you may want to select attributes, or you want to do bagging or boosting. Who knows what bagging and boosting is? Okay, so bagging and boosting is something, well, you don't, it's only for those who care. You don't have to know it really, but it's a way how you can make simple algorithms like decision trees or neural nets or something more efficient by combining or so-called ensemble methods in general into compound models where you use multiple models to create a better prediction, actually. So if you have that, there are certain operators that are well suited for bagging that should go inside. And the problem actually used to be, okay, you have a validation. You also want to use apply model. You loop over attributes. Probably you want to filter for attributes. Or you use bagging. You may want to use a certain kind of learner inside. Okay, so given these three things, I can give all kinds of recommendations, but I can't fit them all in here, and that would not be useful. That's why the larger your process grew over time, these recommendations became less and less useful. Now, that's no longer the case. The recommendations you get here are still useful, but if you drill down into it, you will see that now, all of a sudden, you get the recommendations that are really useful inside this operator, like decision trees, applying models, exactly the ones I wanted to put here. So actually, the recommendations depend on what you're looking at now. That's much more useful because it's more focused and less noise when you have many operators. Another example, inside loop attributes, for instance, most of the time what you want to do there, maybe you want to select attributes, for instance, that you're currently looping over, or inside the bagging or boosting, you may want to drop certain kinds of learners, right? It only recommends learners inside this bagging algorithm. So that's much more useful. So the recommendations have become a lot better, in my opinion. And not only do we recommend operators anymore, we also recommend parameters, which is the second most difficult thing to pick. There are hundreds of operators, but also hundreds or thousands of parameters that you all have to understand. And now you can look into this whenever you see this green arrow here. Green is our wisdom of the crowd's color, actually. Well, what have other users actually done for the splitting criterion inside the decision tree? Most actually go with gain ratio, but some actually switch to Gini index, which is probably the second most interesting criterion that you want to use. And almost no one uses accuracy, which has good statistical reasons. So we have these recommendations here as well that you can use so you can benefit from all this expertise and knowledge inside the community. That concludes my first demo. Yeah, so there are a few things, of course, that we changed that I'm not walking over in detail here, but you can in general say we've really touched a lot of things in the user experience and user interface of RapidMiner that have become much easier. You know, filter examples that we've shown last year, generate attributes, all these recommendations, the error messages are much nicer. The onboarding is much easier, which you will see when you download the latest version. This is, for instance, another example of the preferences dialog, much more useful. All the settings have. I can't use this, I believe. It doesn't have a button. Have information icons now that help you to understand what these settings do. If you build SQL queries frequently, the SQL query builder has been revamped. That also has syntax highlighting and content assist. So if you press Control space and just type I Control space, it auto-completes things that make sense in this situation. So keywords from the SQL language. We have revamped this whole dialog where you define your connections to Twitter, Salesforce, Dropbox, and all those connectors that we have. That's much easier to use in the first place, and also it's more, the grouping on the left-hand side is more structured, so you have all the things that you've loaded from your RapidMiner server. So if I have anything defined on server and it's pulled into Studio, I can clearly see that here. You can edit it in Studio, save it on server. So everything has been just a bit more streamlined, clearer to use, looks a bit fresher. So that was one of the biggest themes, actually, that we've invested in the last year, and we will go continue on this path, as Lars will show shortly in the future. And the second big theme, I've forgotten one thing I definitely need to show you. This very tiny feature. If you have a lengthy process, right, I mean, you always start small, things grow, and then you lose overview of your process. We have introduced something very fancy. Let me go back to RapidMiner with a new process, right? So say you start with a data set, right? So then you want to normalize it, say, right? And then you want to discretize it even, right? And then you want to select only a few of the attributes. So you all do this pre-processing magic that you usually do. Then you do something about the missing values. And then you don't have space anymore. And in the end, say you do your cross-validation. And then you arrive at something that usually looks like this. You didn't plan to do that in the first place, but it turns out you have to do all this stuff before you can start. So now your process is really cluttered up with a lot of pre-processing stuff. Right? So now it comes to magic. You can just mark this, and then you should just group this into sub-process. Bam, there you go. Whoa. tiny thing, and now all your pre-processing is in here, and then now you can also give it a reasonable name, pre-process, whatever. So you have much cleaner processes. That's just a tiny thing, but I think very helpful for your everyday work. And this is the way how we're thinking currently, and we're going to continue on this path. Second big theme is really performance. Decision tree is one of the most important operators because it's learning algorithms, because it's so nice to look at, actually. I think we have to admit that performance was not optimal up until recently. This is completely new thing now, completely revamped, is multi-core now, you can't even tell how much faster it is. It can be, I don't know, up to 100 times, and it can handle much more memory. And as you see here, the more cores you have on your machine, the faster it also gets, in fact. So that is something that we have significantly boosted that will be a lot more fun to use. Another thing is the expressions. I just showed that. So the red curve at the top is the old expression parser that came from a third-party library that we've been using in the past. And the new expression parser is not only clearer to use and less error-prone with the macros and stuff, but it's also factored 2.5 to 3 faster, in particular if you have many constants in there. So they put a lot of optimization into that, much less overhead. If you have many attributes, for instance, a lot of overhead is eliminated. So that's a lot faster, in fact. Same holds for data import. This is something that shows the performance of the read Excel operator or the Excel import wizard. That also, we used to use a library for that also in the past, and that had quite a big memory footprint that prevented you actually from reading Excel files into RapidMiner effectively. You would have to convert it to CSV before you were able to do that because the overhead was just so large. Not only was it slow, but also the overhead was fast, so you couldn't import large files in the first place. And now on the right-hand side, you see that the memory footprint inside RapidMiner is roughly the size of the file. So if you have a 234 megabyte file, then you were not able to import that, or this particular file, at least in RapidMiner 6.2, but in 6.3, the memory footprint inside RapidMiner is roughly the size of the file, as you would expect. We've improved a lot more stuff, not only Excel, also XML, the access to databases, the write access is much more efficient, also including RapidMiner server repositories. The database metadata is that's fetched from the database for the SQL builder, for instance, is more efficient. We've reduced the communication between studio and server, so even if you're on a slower connection there, this is boosted a bit. So this is really the other big theme that we had in the recent releases. So one more thing I want to show is the integration of scripting operators, Python and R. Many of you probably know the old R extension that was not so easy to use because, in particular, because installation was so tricky. We have completely changed that. So we're not integrating so tightly with it anymore. You can use everything that you have in your log. If you want to use R or Python, we just assume you have R or Python anyway, because otherwise you wouldn't want to use it, right? That's the reason why you want to use it. So you have it installed. You can use everything in your R and Python installation from within RapidMiner, and in order to install it, it's really pretty simple. In fact, most of the time it's auto-detected So if you use the execute Python operator, if you want to see the configuration, it's in the, you can go to the preferences, and basically all that you have to do is specify the path to this executable. In case that is not set, so when you start RapidMiner for the first time, you will see this. You drag in the execute Python operator. Probably it has been auto-configured, auto-detected. If not, you just click here. You select the folder. That's Anaconda is the Python distribution. You just pick the Python executable, and then you can click test, and it will show you nothing. It shows you we detected Python 2.710, and all is good. It also checks whether there are any dependencies missing, like the pandas module, for instance. We're using the pandas data frame for representing tables. So this configuration is pretty simple. If you want to run a script, you can paste it in here. We don't expect you to paste thousands of lines in here. Rather, we expect you to have your own scripts that are then found by Python. And how this works is really simple. You define one method, which is called rmain, one function that gets passed the data objects, right? That's whatever goes in here into the first port of the operator. Then you do something with it, and then you just return it. In this case, you return 2 data sets. They would arrive in the first 2 ports. So, because it's too tricky for me to type a Python script now, I would have prepared something to show you what you can do with it. So what we have here, we just load iris again. We drop the ID attribute. We define a macro, right? A macro to the value of 3. Which you can use in here as well, right? So this is the use of the macro. So this is the script in Python. We are being passed the data object. We log something to the console. We're dropping the label attribute. So just as I dropped the ID attribute here, we're dropping the label attribute here. And then what we do is we use the k-means algorithm, which comes from the sklearn.cluster module. We set the number of clusters to this macro, right, and then we fit it to the data. And there we go, that's it. Then we define the roles inside RapidMiner, so RapidMiner knows these roles like cluster, label, stuff like that. We define that here, the RapidMiner metadata. The cluster is of type integer, and it's this attribute in the pandas data frame, and then we return it. So let's run that. No big surprise. Let's first look at the data briefly. So we have the 4 attributes that all of you know, probably from the iris data set, and we have the cluster number here, just as a clustering algorithm inside RapidMiner would look like. Just to be sure that this is something meaningful, we can assign that to the axis again and colorize it according to cluster. And I've set this to grayscale currently, so you see white or bright white, bright light gray, gray, and black, the 3 clusters. So that's roughly what you would expect. It's exactly what you would expect. So you can use these algorithms. You can use data sets. But you can also do more advanced stuff. You can also use Python models, right? Because that's usually, clustering just adds a row to your data set. But if you do modeling, you first produce a model, and then in a different process, you want to do the scoring. Right? So there's an apply model here. There's something that builds a model here and then applies a model here. So 2 Python scripts. The first script actually takes this data set and creates a decision tree. Right? That comes also from the sklearn package. You fit the decision tree, and there you go. You return the tree. I'm not sure whether you can see that from the rows in the back, but that's how it works. And the second Python operator receives this thing here and receives a RapidMiner example set, right? And on these 2 ports, we receive the model and the data, and then we apply this model. We call the predict method on this model in Python, and create this new column inside the data frame. So you can even parse objects that RapidMiner does not understand. So RapidMiner understands example sets and Python's version of a table, which is a data frame, pandas data frame. But it does not understand anything else, but you can still pass it through your process. And that's actually the beauty of this approach. If I run this from, through the process and add a breakpoint before the second operator here, we will see that we receive a data set and something that RapidMiner does not understand. So you can't look at it, but you can still use it. So if you continue the process, in the end, you will see the results, so the original label and the prediction, right? And then you can look at the correct predictions. These are those here, or the incorrect predictions, or there aren't any. That's suspicious. But yeah, so this way you can pass different objects. Also store them in the repository, by the way, in RapidMiner repository, RapidMiner server, if you want, and use them transparently. And that's particularly beautiful if you do that with charts. Oh, sorry, that was rubbish. So this Python script actually does two things. First, and we should mention that as well, of course, Python now gives you access to all the connectivity of Python. Data reader, this talks to Yahoo to fetch some stock data and then uses the matplotlib library to plot things, right? So it creates a chart file and we actually return this chart. And then within RapidMiner, we could now write it to the repository. RapidMiner, in this case, writes it to my desktop. I don't know if you can see that. That's my desktop. So look at my desktop. Empty, right? Almost empty. So I try to be fast. So I run the process, minimize this. Press F5. Ah, there we go. So, and now I have this chart here on my desktop, and this is how it looks like. And what makes this extremely powerful is, of course, as you know, all these things using RapidMiner server can now very easily be turned into a web service. So if you would have your prediction there, you could immediately turn that into a parameterized web service and embed that into a website, for instance, with just a single click. So that's quite powerful, in fact. I like that a lot. Yeah, so that was my last and final demo. A few more remarks. Well, you may also have seen also in the previous release, we have much nicer charts on our RapidMiner server based on HTML5 that run in all environments. Not only charts, but also maps that are very interactive, so you can hover over them, trigger all kinds of effects if you click on individual data points, define interactions with other processes and stuff like that. And we have lots of new stuff in Hadoop, right, across the complete workflow, from data access over mashup to modeling and prediction. So the first thing is now, even in standard RapidMiner Studio, not in Hadoop, you can access the Hive connector, as you see on the top right. The Hive connector is there, so you can load dataset into standard RapidMiner. We have lots of mashup and pre-processing operators, PCA, pivoting, stuff like that, correlation and covariance, noise, and stuff like that. And what's particularly nice is we have support for Spark now. The MLlib library we are using for that. That supports 3 new algorithms, a decision tree, logistic regression, and a linear regression. So there's more and more stuff that you can push down into Hadoop that makes it even more powerful. And actually, from this slide, what I actually like most is the fact that whatever you generate in any context inside RapidMiner can be run, any model can be run inside Hadoop. So you can train a model in classical RapidMiner Studio, save it in your repository or wherever, and then run this standard model inside RapidMiner Hadoop, although this is not a Spark model or whatsoever. This makes it really very powerful and flexible. And also it's much more easy to integrate with basically all the major distributions, Cloudera, Hortonworks. We run on MapR and DataSex. We run on Amazon out of the box now, on EMR, Elastic MapReduce, and also with the standard Apache distribution. So this should be much more, very, very easy to set up now also, in particular, since we have improved the connection diagnosis. So it's really, if you have a problem with connecting to it, as you all know, Hadoop can be very tricky to configure. It will be a lot easier now to spot the root cause for any errors that you may see. And we also integrate much more easily with advanced stuff like all these security technologies, Kerberos, Sentry, and Ranger, for authentication and authorization. The doc side is completely new. We welcome your feedback. So a bit of a this is cut off. We have a getting started guide, not so useful for you probably, but the operator reference guide is completely online. We have lots of how-tos that explain how to do certain things. We'll add more stuff to this over time. Yeah, lots of stuff is going online there. And finally, for you as the community, it's become a lot easier, since 10 minutes to, I hope, to create extensions for RapidMiner Studio, also for the current version, if you want to get to the sources, cloners or focus on GitHub. But really building an extension is very elegant now, because all you do is you clone a template that's also on GitHub for your extension. You now make few configurations. What's the name? Basically, that's the only thing that you have to define. What's the name of your extension? And then there's a scaffolding target in Gradle. Gradle is the build tool, the Java build tool that you use for compiling your stuff. That will set up all the dummy files, the XML files, Java files that you need to, and then, well, then you can compile it, immediately install it with just one more command. Pretty easy. This won't do anything, then you still have to do some programming, but setting it up is pretty easy. So that concludes my talk. I'm a bit behind time. Sorry for that. Wow.